The door creaks open once more, and you've stepped across the threshold into Nightmare House of Horror, where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, where the familiar transforms into something altogether more sinister. I am your guide through these darkened halls, a curator of tales that whisper rather than scream. Here, we explore horror that begins in the most mundane settings. Suburban kitchens where the morning coffee tastes slightly metallic. Office buildings where elevators stop at floors that don't exist. Tonight's offering is The Virus, The Ghost, and The Portal. 3 tales that understand true terror lives in the spaces between certainty and doubt. The virus spreads through the very images we trust to show us truth. The ghost feeds on willing sacrifice, transforming love into consumption. The portal reveals art as a trap, where creativity becomes a gateway to dimensional horror. Each corruption begins in a sanctuary of human creation, the photographer's darkroom, the elementary classroom, the restorer's workshop. Tonight, we discover what happens when these sacred spaces become hunting grounds. So close your eyes to the safe world outside, and prepare to discover that the monster glimpsed in peripheral vision is always more terrifying than the one spotlit center stage. The house is waiting, and tonight's trinity of nightmares has already begun. James had been walking the same downtown streets for 17 years, his camera capturing the unconscious poetry of urban life. The weight of his Leica hung familiar against his chest as he navigated the Thursday morning crowd, seeking those moments when light and shadow conspired to reveal something true about the human condition. He developed an eye for the spaces between, the pause before a businessman checked his watch, the hesitation in a mother's step as she guided her child across the street, the way strangers' eyes would meet and immediately look away. The city breathed around him in rhythms he'd learned to read like sheet music. The rush of morning commuters had its own tempo, distinct from the leisurely afternoon stroll of shoppers or the urgent pulse of evening workers fleeing their offices. James positioned himself at intersections and bus stops, outside cafes and in park corners, waiting for those perfect moments when human nature revealed itself without artifice. His apartment building squatted between a Korean restaurant and a used bookstore, its brick facade stained with decades of exhaust and weather. The basement had been converted into his darkroom years ago, a sanctuary where the mechanical act of photography transformed into something approaching alchemy. Red light painted everything the color of dried blood as he moved through the ritual of development, each photograph emerging like a ghost materializing from the chemical baths. The process never lost its magic for James. Watching images slowly appear in the developer, seeing faces and moments crystallize from blank paper, felt like participating in some ancient form of resurrection. He'd spent countless nights in that crimson-lit space, developing roll after roll, searching for the perfect frame that would capture something essential about the human experience. He'd been working late into the night, processing the previous day's roll, when he first noticed her. The chemicals had been mixed fresh that evening, their sharp tang filling the small space with familiar comfort. James worked methodically, timing each stage with the precision of a surgeon, his movements automatic after years of practice. Frame 17 showed the usual lunch crowd outside Miller's Deli, but there, in the background near the bus stop, stood a woman who shouldn't have been there. James remembered the moment distinctly. An argument between 2 construction workers had drawn his attention, their voices rising above the traffic noise like angry gulls. The larger man had gestured wildly with a half-eaten sandwich, his face flushed with frustration. His companion, smaller but more aggressive, had pointed an accusatory finger while shouting about overtime pay and broken promises. James had captured the mid-gesture, their faces twisted with frustration and fatigue, the kind of raw emotion that made for compelling street photography. But the woman standing behind them, partially obscured by the bus shelter's shadow, had definitely not been there when he'd taken the shot. He was certain of this because he always checked his backgrounds, always scanned the entire frame before pressing the shutter. It was second nature, as automatic as breathing. She was pale, unnaturally so, with dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her dress appeared to be from another era, something from the 1940s or 50s, with a fitted bodice and full skirt that fell to mid-calf. The fabric looked heavy, like wool or thick cotton, and it hung on her frame in a way that suggested she'd lost weight recently. What disturbed James most was her expression. While everyone else in the frame moved with purpose or distraction, she stared directly at the camera with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Her eyes held a knowledge that seemed to burn through the photographic paper, as if she could see him standing in his darkroom decades after the moment had been captured. James convinced himself it was a trick of light and shadow, perhaps someone who'd moved into the frame at the last second. Street photography was full of such accidents, faces that appeared and disappeared in the urban flow, creating mysterious narratives that existed only in the frozen moment of exposure. Sometimes a reflection in a window would create the illusion of an extra person, or a shadow would fall in just such a way as to suggest a human form where none existed. But as he continued developing the role, she appeared again. Frame 23 captured a group of teenagers outside the record store. Their laughter caught mid-expression as one of them gestured toward a poster in the window. The girl in front wore a vintage band t-shirt, her face bright with the kind of joy that comes from discovering music that speaks to your soul. Her friends clustered around her, their bodies forming the natural composition that James loved to capture, human beings unconsciously creating art through their relationships to each other. And there she was again, this time standing in the doorway of the shop behind them. But something was wrong with her appearance. The unnatural pallor had deepened, taking on a grayish quality that reminded James of old newsprint. What looked like bruises darkened her throat and wrists, purple-black marks that stood out starkly against her skin. Her dress hung differently, as if it had been torn and hastily mended with invisible thread. The smile she wore was too wide, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous, as if her mouth held more ivory than any human jaw could accommodate. The teenagers in the foreground remained unchanged, their expressions frozen in that moment of pure happiness. But the woman behind them seemed to exist in a different reality, one where pain and violence had left their marks on her flesh. Her eyes, still fixed on the camera, now held something beyond mere knowledge. They carried accusation, as if James himself was responsible for whatever had happened to her. By frame 31, James's hands were shaking as he lifted the photograph from the developer. The woman now stood at the edge of a group of office workers waiting for the crosswalk signal to change. The scene was utterly mundane, people checking their phones, adjusting briefcases, squinting against the afternoon sun, but her throat had been opened, a dark line stretching from ear to ear. The wound gaped like a second mouth, and something that might have been blood had stained the front of her dress black in a pattern that reminded James of spilled ink. Her eyes, still fixed on the camera, now held an accusatory glare that made James step back from the enlarger. The other figures in the photograph remained oblivious to her presence, going about their business as if nothing unusual stood among them. But she dominated the frame despite being relegated to the background, her presence so powerful that James found it difficult to focus on anything else. He spent the rest of the night poring over the photographs, using a magnifying glass to examine every detail. The woman's progressive deterioration was undeniable. In each subsequent frame, her body showed more evidence of violence, fingers missing, sections of her face carved away, her dress hanging in tatters that revealed glimpses of something underneath that wasn't quite flesh. The wounds appeared surgical in their precision, as if someone with medical knowledge had systematically dismantled her body. But it was her eyes that haunted him most. They never left the camera, never blinked, never showed anything but that growing awareness of what was happening to her. In the later frames, they held a kind of desperate intelligence, as if she was trying to communicate something vital across the decades that separated her death from his discovery of her image. James tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Double exposures were a common problem with older cameras, particularly when the film advance mechanism began to wear. Contamination in the developing chemicals could create strange artifacts, phantom images that appeared to be part of the original photograph. But the woman interacted with the environment in ways that suggested she was actually there. Her shadow fell correctly. Her dress moved in response to the same wind that affected the other figures in the frame. In one photograph, a pigeon had landed on her outstretched hand, its tiny claws gripping fingers that were already beginning to show signs of decay. The bird's posture was natural, relaxed, as if it saw nothing unusual about perching on the hand of a woman who had been dead for decades. In another frame, her shadow fell across a newspaper lying on a bench, the darkness of her silhouette obscuring headlines about events that had happened long after her death. Research at the local library consumed his weekend. The building was one of those Carnegie libraries built in the early 1900s, its reading room filled with the kind of heavy wooden tables and green-shaded lamps that suggested serious scholarship. James had always found comfort in libraries, in the quiet rustle of turning pages and the whispered conversations of dedicated researchers. He scanned through decades of newspaper archives, looking for any mention of a woman matching the figure in his photographs. The microfilm reader hummed softly as he advanced through years of headlines, crime reports, and obituaries. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, had worked there for 30 years and proved surprisingly helpful when James described what he was looking for. She was a small woman with silver hair and thick glasses, but her memory for local history was encyclopedic. She directed him to the crime section of the archives, specifically the years 1952 through 1955. There was a series of murders during that period, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper despite the empty reading room. Women found in alleys, always the same pattern of injuries. The police never caught the killer, and after the fifth victim, the murders just stopped. People said he might have moved on, or died, or simply found other ways to satisfy his urges. The headline appeared in the October 31st edition of the Herald. Local woman found murdered in alley behind Miller's Deli. The accompanying photograph showed a face that James recognized immediately. Catherine Morse, 26 years old, had been discovered in the early morning hours by a delivery driver making his rounds. The article described wounds that matched exactly what James had observed in his photographs: the throat cut, the missing fingers, the carved sections of flesh that suggested a killer with anatomical knowledge. Catherine had been a secretary at the courthouse, the article revealed. She'd worked late that night, staying behind to finish typing a brief for a murder trial that was scheduled to begin the following week. The irony wasn't lost on James. A woman who spent her days documenting violence had become a victim of the very brutality she transcribed from courtroom testimony. The killer had never been found. Detective Samuel Morrison had led the investigation, pursuing dozens of leads that eventually led nowhere. The case had consumed him, according to the follow-up articles, driving him to work 16-hour days and alienating his family. 3 years after Catherine's murder, Morrison had taken his own life, leaving behind a note that simply read, "She's still watching. She knows what I did wrong." But Catherine Morse had died 70 years ago, and according to the article, her body had been discovered in the same alley where James often set up to photograph the lunch crowd outside Miller's Deli. The alley had been bricked up in the late 1950s, according to city records, but James knew it well. He'd taken hundreds of photographs from that vantage point, drawn by the way the narrow space framed the street beyond. That evening, James developed a new roll of film, hoping to find the photographs free of the impossible woman. He'd spent the day walking different routes, avoiding Miller's Deli entirely, focusing on subjects in neighborhoods far from downtown. But Catherine appeared in even more frames, and her condition had worsened. Pieces of her were simply missing now, sections of her torso, entire limbs, portions of her face. She resembled a puzzle with crucial pieces removed, yet somehow she continued to stand, to move, to stare at the camera with those accusing eyes. In one particularly disturbing image, Catherine stood behind a young mother pushing a stroller through the park. The woman smiled as she pointed out ducks to her toddler, oblivious to the mutilated figure that loomed over her shoulder. Catherine's face was partially gone, revealing something underneath that might have been bone or might have been shadow. Her remaining eye fixed on the camera with an expression of such profound sadness that James found himself fighting back tears. The first call came on Tuesday morning. Mrs. Patterson from the coffee shop had purchased one of James's photographs the previous week, a cheerful street scene featuring children playing in the fountain at Central Park. She was calling to complain about the print, saying there was something wrong with it. When James pressed for details, Mrs. Patterson's voice became strained, almost fearful. "There's a woman in the background," she said. "She wasn't there when I first looked at the picture, I'm sure of it, but now I can't stop seeing her. She's hurt, Mr. James, badly hurt, and she keeps looking at me." James's blood went cold. The photograph Mrs. Patterson had purchased was one of his favorites from the past month, a spontaneous capture of childhood joy that had reminded him why he'd become a photographer in the first place. He'd studied it carefully before printing it, and there had been no sign of Catherine Morse in any part of the composition. He asked Mrs. Patterson to describe the woman, and the details matched Catherine Morse perfectly: the pale skin, the dark hair, the dress from another era. But Mrs. Patterson added something that made James's hands shake as he held the phone. "I've been having dreams," she whispered. "Dreams where I'm her. I can feel what happened to her. The knife, the pain, the terror. It's like she's trying to show me her death, over and over again. I wake up with my throat burning, and there are scratches on my arms that weren't there when I went to sleep." More calls followed throughout the week. Every person who had purchased one of James's recent photographs reported the same phenomenon. Catherine Morse was appearing in their prints, and her presence was somehow infecting their dreams, their waking thoughts. They described experiencing her murder from the inside, feeling the killer's hands on their throat, the blade sliding between their ribs. Several had sought medical attention for phantom pains that corresponded to Catherine's wounds. Mr. Rodriguez, who'd bought a photograph of the evening rush hour outside the train station, called to report that he'd been waking up every night at 3:37, the exact time Catherine's body had been discovered. Mrs. Kelly, who'd purchased a print of street musicians performing in the square, found herself unable to listen to music without hearing screams buried beneath the melodies. James realized with growing horror that his photographs had become vectors for something far worse than a simple haunting. Catherine's trauma was spreading like a virus through the images, infecting anyone who looked at them with the experience of her death. Each person who viewed the photographs became a carrier, experiencing her murder and somehow keeping her suffering alive. The gallery opening on Friday night was supposed to be James's breakthrough, his first solo exhibition, featuring 30 of his best street photographs from the past year. The gallery owner, Marcus Hoffman, had been enthusiastic about the collection, praising James's ability to capture the authentic soul of urban life. The opening was well attended, drawing art collectors, photography enthusiasts, and curious members of the public. But as the evening progressed, James watched the attendees with growing dread. They moved through the gallery normally at first, wine glasses in hand, making the usual polite comments about composition and lighting. The crowd was diverse, young professionals seeking cultural sophistication, older collectors with serious money to spend, art students absorbing influences for their own work. But one by one, they began to change. A woman in a red dress stopped in front of one of the photographs, a shot of commuters waiting for the morning train, and began touching her throat compulsively. Her conversation with her companion trailed off as she stared at something in the image that others couldn't see. Her fingers traced the line where Catherine's wound would be, and she began to make small, unconscious sounds of distress. A man near the back wall dropped his wine glass, the sound of shattering crystal cutting through the murmur of conversation. His face had gone pale as he stared at a photograph of children playing in a playground, his eyes fixed on the background where Catherine's mutilated form was apparently becoming visible. He backed away from the wall, shaking his head and mumbling denials that no one could understand. Soon, whispers filled the gallery as guests began pointing at the backgrounds of photographs, describing a woman who shouldn't be there, a figure growing more mutilated with each viewing. The atmosphere shifted from celebration to confusion to something approaching panic. People began leaving early, their faces troubled, their steps hurried. James tried to remove the photographs, but it was too late. The virus had spread beyond his control. People were pulling out their phones, taking pictures of his pictures, sharing them on social media with captions about strange artifacts and unexplained appearances. Catherine Morse was replicating herself through digital channels, her suffering multiplying exponentially. Each shared image carried her trauma to new victims, and each new victim became a conduit for her endless, spreading death. The social media posts began within hours, people reporting strange dreams, phantom pains, and the persistent sense of being watched by something malevolent. The photographs were shared and reshared, each iteration carrying Catherine's curse to wider and wider circles of unwitting victims. By midnight, the emergency rooms in 3 hospitals were flooded with people experiencing phantom wounds, phantom pain, phantom deaths. They described the same woman, the same murder, the same sense of being trapped in someone else's final moments. The medical staff had no explanation for the symptoms, patients with no physical injuries writhing in agony, describing wounds that didn't exist, begging for help that doctors couldn't provide. The authorities had no explanation for the mass hysteria, but James understood with crystalline clarity what was happening. Catherine Morse wasn't just haunting his photographs. She was using them to transform her singular death into a multiplying horror, spreading her trauma like a contagion through the interconnected web of human consciousness. Each person who experienced her murder became a new vessel for her pain, and that pain sought new hosts with the relentless hunger of a virus. The victims described not just her physical suffering, but her emotional anguish, the betrayal she'd felt when her killer had first struck, the disbelief that had given way to terror, the final moments of awareness as her life had drained away in that dark alley. James found himself back in his darkroom, surrounded by prints of Catherine in various stages of destruction. She stared out at him from dozens of photographs, her eyes holding not just accusation now, but satisfaction. She had found a way to make her death eternal, to ensure that her suffering would never end because it would never stop finding new victims to consume. The phone rang constantly, reporters, police, medical professionals, all trying to understand what was happening, but James had stopped answering. He stood in the red light of his darkroom, watching his new photographs develop themselves without his assistance. The chemical baths bubbled and churned, producing image after image of Catherine Morse, each one showing her in a different location, infecting a different photograph, spreading to a different victim. The images were impossible, photographs he'd never taken, of places he'd never been. Catherine appeared in family snapshots from decades past, in tourist photos taken in distant countries, in security footage from buildings she'd never entered while alive. She was rewriting the photographic record of human experience, inserting herself into every image as a witness to the violence that lay beneath the surface of civilization. The virus had escaped containment. Catherine's death was becoming everyone's death, her murder transforming into a shared experience that would ripple through human consciousness until every person who had ever looked at a photograph understood exactly what it felt like to die at the hands of a killer whose name had been lost to time. James picked up his camera one final time, feeling its familiar weight against his chest. He had become the vector for something ancient and hungry, something that had learned to use the very act of seeing as a weapon. Through his lens, Catherine Morse had found a way to make her death immortal, to ensure that her suffering would spread through the world like a plague of images, infecting every eye that dared to look. The last photograph he took showed his own reflection in the darkroom mirror, but he wasn't alone in the frame. Catherine stood behind him, her mutilated form finally complete, her smile wide with the satisfaction of a virus that had found the perfect host. And in her eyes, James saw not just the memory of her death, but the promise of everyone else's. As he watched, his own reflection began to change. His skin took on the same grayish pallor that marked Catherine's flesh, and dark lines appeared across his throat. He was becoming part of her collection, another victim in the endless gallery of suffering that she was creating through the medium of photography itself. The camera fell from his hands as he felt the first cut, though no blade touched his skin. Catherine's death was becoming his death, and through him, it would spread to every person who had ever trusted a photograph to tell them the truth about the world. Linda had accepted the position at Millbrook Elementary with the kind of desperate relief that comes from unemployment stretching into its 4th month. The bills had been piling up like autumn leaves, and her savings account had dwindled to a number that made her stomach clench every time she checked her balance. Teaching positions were scarce in the current economy, and she'd been applying to districts throughout Pennsylvania, willing to travel anywhere that would have her. The drive through the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania had been pleasant enough in the early September morning. The landscape rolled past her car windows like a pastoral painting, golden fields dotted with red barns, forests beginning to show the first hints of autumn color, farmhouses that looked like they'd been standing since the Revolutionary War. She'd lowered the windows to let in the crisp air, thinking that maybe this change of scenery was exactly what she needed after the disappointment of her last position. But as she turned onto the narrow road leading to the school, something about the landscape began to feel wrong. The trees pressed too close to the asphalt, their branches creating a tunnel of green that filtered the sunlight into an aquatic dimness. The farmhouses she glimpsed between the foliage seemed to crouch rather than stand, their windows dark and uninviting. Even the fields looked different here. The corn grew in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and the scarecrows were positioned in ways that suggested they were watching the road rather than protecting crops. The GPS on her phone lost signal somewhere along that winding road, and Linda found herself relying on hand-drawn directions that Principal Morrison had mailed to her. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and the ink had a strange quality that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at it. She'd assumed it was just poor photocopying, but now she wasn't so sure. Millbrook Elementary itself was a single-story brick building that had probably been modern in 1965. Now it squatted among the maples like a red toad, its windows reflecting the sky in ways that made them look like closed eyes. The architecture was utilitarian, lacking any of the welcoming features that usually marked elementary schools. There was no colorful playground equipment, no cheerful murals on the walls, no flower gardens tended by enthusiastic students. The building simply existed, as if it had grown from the earth rather than being constructed by human hands. Principal Morrison met her at the front entrance, a thin man with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd been drinking too much coffee for too many years. His handshake was damp, and his eyes had the darting quality of someone who expected trouble but couldn't identify its source. He was younger than Linda had expected from their phone conversation, perhaps 45, but his hair was prematurely gray and his skin had the pale quality of someone who spent too much time indoors. "We're so grateful you could start immediately," he said, pumping her hand with damp enthusiasm. "The children have been without a proper teacher for 3 weeks now. Miss Catherine's departure was unexpected." Linda had pressed for details during her phone interview, but Morrison had been evasive. "A family emergency," he'd said. Miss Catherine had needed to leave suddenly. something about a sick relative in another state. The substitute who'd filled in for the first week had also left unexpectedly, citing a change in personal circumstances, as had the second substitute. Linda was the fourth person to take the position in less than a month. The children are very fond of Miss Catherine. Morrison continued as he led her through corridors that smelled of industrial disinfectant and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. They've been asking about her constantly. You may find them resistant to change. The hallways were too quiet for a school building. Linda had taught in dozens of schools over her 12-year career, and she'd never experienced such complete silence during school hours. Usually, there was the constant background hum of activity, children's voices from classrooms, teachers giving instructions, the squeak of sneakers on polished floors. Here, the only sound was their footsteps echoing off the walls. Room 12 was at the end of the main hallway, and Linda felt a chill as Morrison opened the door. The classroom was perfectly ordinary, 24 desks arranged in neat rows, a whiteboard at the front, educational posters covering the walls. But there was something in the air, a sense of waiting, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The desks were too perfectly aligned, the supplies too neatly organized, as if everything had been arranged by someone with an obsessive attention to detail. "The children will be arriving shortly," Morrison said, checking his watch with the nervous gesture of someone constantly running behind schedule. "Third grade, ages 8 and 9. They're good kids, just attached to their routines. Don't take it personally if they seem distant at first." Linda spent the remaining minutes before the bell arranging her materials and trying to shake off the unease that had settled over her like a cold fog. She taught third grade for 12 years before budget cuts had eliminated her position at Lincoln Elementary. Children were children, regardless of location. She knew how to win them over, how to establish the delicate balance of authority and warmth that made for successful classroom management. The first student to enter was a girl with blonde pigtails and a dress that looked like it had been pressed that morning. She walked with the careful precision of someone much older, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture perfectly straight. She took her seat in the front row without looking at Linda, her eyes fixed on the empty desk beside the teacher's station. Her movements were economical, practiced, as if she'd performed this routine countless times before. "Good morning," Linda said brightly, using the cheerful tone that usually put nervous children at ease. "I'm Mrs. Henderson. What's your name?" The girl turned her head slowly, as if Linda's voice had reached her from a great distance. When their eyes met, Linda felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The child's gaze was ancient, holding a knowledge that no 8-year-old should possess. "I'm Sarah," she said. Her voice was clear and perfectly modulated, like a small adult doing an impression of a child. Miss Catherine used to sit right there. She pointed to the empty desk with a precision that suggested she'd measured the distance. More children filed in, each one moving with the same careful precision. They were clean and well-dressed, their hair neatly combed, their faces scrubbed. But there was something wrong with their uniformity, as if they were all following the same invisible script. They took their seats without the usual morning chaos of children, without talking or fidgeting or displaying any of the natural restlessness Linda had come to expect. The silence was unnatural. In all her years of teaching, Linda had never seen children move so quietly, so purposefully. Even the most well-behaved students usually carried some trace of childhood energy, a whispered comment to a friend, a dropped pencil, the rustle of papers being arranged. These children moved like small automatons, their behavior so perfectly controlled that it felt rehearsed. As she took attendance, Linda noticed that several of the children were missing small pieces of themselves. Sarah's left earlobe was gone, not torn or injured, but simply absent, as if it had never existed. The skin where it should have been was smooth and unmarked, healed so completely that it suggested the absence was intentional rather than accidental. The boy behind her, Timothy, was missing the tip of his right index finger. Amy in the third row had a perfect circular hole in her left palm, about the size of a pencil eraser. David, sitting near the window, was missing a small patch of skin from his left cheek, creating a smooth depression that caught the light strangely. The wounds, if they could be called wounds, were completely healed, showing no signs of trauma or discomfort. "Sarah," Linda said carefully, trying to keep her voice neutral, "what happened to your ear?" Sarah's hand moved automatically to the spot where her earlobe should have been, her fingers tracing the smooth edge of skin with the unconscious gesture of someone touching a familiar scar. "I shared it with Miss Catherine," she said matter-of-factly. "She needed it for the lesson." The other children nodded in agreement, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Their unanimity was unsettling, 24 young faces expressing the same calm acceptance of something that should have horrified them. Timothy held up his hand, displaying his truncated finger with something that looked like pride. "I gave her this last week," he said. "She said it would help me learn my multiplication tables. And it did. I can do them all the way to 12 now." Linda felt something cold crawl up her spine. "Children, that's not possible. You can't just give someone parts of your body." "But we can," said Amy, pressing her finger through the hole in her palm with casual ease. "Miss Catherine taught us how. She said sharing ourselves was the most important lesson of all. She said that's how love really works. You give pieces of yourself to the people who matter." The morning progressed with a surreal quality that made Linda question her own sanity. The children were impeccably behaved, responding to her questions with the same careful precision they'd shown when entering the classroom. But every few minutes, one of them would make a reference to Miss Catherine, describing lessons that couldn't have happened, activities that defied basic human biology. During math instruction, Timothy explained that Miss Catherine had taught them to count using their missing pieces. "Each part we give her represents a number," he said. "I'm up to 7 now. Sarah is at 5, but she's planning to give more soon." Amy raised her hand to share that Miss Catherine had taught them about fractions by showing them how their missing pieces related to their whole bodies. "I'm missing 1/48 of myself," she said with the confidence of a child who'd done the calculation many times. "Miss Catherine says that when I get to 1/4, I'll understand everything." During recess, Linda watched from the window as the children stood in a perfect circle in the playground. They weren't playing, they were simply standing there, their faces turned toward the empty space in the center of the circle. Their mouths moved in unison, as if they were reciting something, but Linda couldn't hear the words through the glass. The sight was profoundly unsettling, like watching a ritual performed by tiny cultists. After exactly 15 minutes, they broke the circle and returned to their desks, their faces glowing with the kind of satisfaction that comes from a job well done. Their movements remained synchronized, each child taking their seat at precisely the same moment, folding their hands in identical positions. "What were you doing outside?" Linda asked as they settled back into their seats. "Talking to Miss Catherine," said David. Linda noticed that he was missing a small patch of skin from his left cheek, about the size of a quarter. The area was smooth and unmarked, as if the flesh had simply chosen not to exist. "She comes during recess to check on us." "David, Miss Catherine isn't here anymore. She left the school." The children exchanged glances that seemed to carry entire conversations. Their silent communication was another unsettling detail. They appeared to share thoughts without speaking, understanding each other through some method that excluded the adults around them. Sarah raised her hand with the mechanical precision of a well-trained student. "Mrs. Henderson," she said. "Miss Catherine didn't leave. She just went to a different kind of place, but she still teaches us. She's been teaching us for a very long time." Linda spent her lunch break in the faculty lounge, trying to process what she'd witnessed. The room was decorated with the usual teacher paraphernalia, motivational posters, coffee-stained furniture, a bulletin board covered with announcements about curriculum changes and staff meetings. But even here, the atmosphere felt wrong. The other teachers were friendly enough, but when she mentioned the children's missing body parts, they seemed to lose interest in the conversation. Mrs. Garrett, who taught second grade, suggested that Linda might be seeing things that weren't there, that the stress of a new position could play tricks on the mind. She was an older woman, perhaps 60, with a kind of patient demeanor that came from decades in the classroom. But when she reached for her coffee mug, Linda noticed that she was missing several fingernails, the nail beds smooth and pink as if they'd never grown nails at all. The children love their games, Mrs. Garrett said, refilling her coffee mug with hands that Linda now realized were incomplete. They're very imaginative, very creative. Don't read too much into their stories. Mr. Blackwood, the gym teacher, nodded in agreement. He was a large man with a kind of build that suggested he'd been athletic in his youth, but Linda noticed that his left ear was missing its upper portion, the cartilage simply absent. Kids around here have always been different, he said. It's the isolation, maybe. Makes them come up with strange explanations for things. The casual way the other teachers discussed the children's conditions made Linda realize that this wasn't a recent development. Whatever was happening at Millbrook Elementary had been going on for some time, long enough for the adults to accept it as normal. The thought terrified her more than the missing body parts themselves. That afternoon, Linda decided to address the situation directly. She asked the children to put their heads down while she examined their hands, arms, and faces more closely. What she found made her stomach turn. Each child was missing multiple small pieces, a patch of skin here, a fingernail there, the tip of an ear, a small section of lip. The removals were clean and precise, as if someone had used surgical instruments to take exactly what they wanted. But the children showed no signs of pain or distress. In fact, they seemed proud of their missing pieces, displaying them like badges of honor. When Linda asked about the missing parts, they spoke of them as gifts, offerings made willingly to someone they loved. "Children," Linda said, keeping her voice carefully neutral, "can you tell me more about Miss Catherine? What did she look like?" "She was beautiful," said Sarah, her eyes taking on a dreamy quality. She had long dark hair that moved like water, and the kindest eyes you've ever seen. She wore a blue dress with white buttons, and when she smiled, it made you feel like the most important person in the world. "She was always hungry," added Timothy, "but not for food. She was hungry for us, for our love, for the pieces we could share with her. And we were happy to feed her," said Amy. "It made her so happy when we shared ourselves. She said it was the only way she could keep teaching us, the only way she could stay with us forever." Linda felt the room begin to spin. The children's words carried a sinister undertone that made her skin crawl, but their expressions remained innocent, trusting. They spoke of mutilation as if it were an act of love, of physical sacrifice, as if it were a natural part of education. "When did you first meet Miss Catherine?" Linda asked, her voice barely steady. The children looked at each other with that same silent communication. Finally, Sarah spoke for the group, her young voice carrying the weight of something far older than her years. "We've always known Miss Catherine," she said. "Our parents knew her. Their parents knew her. She's been teaching at Millbrook for a very long time, longer than anyone can remember." After school, Linda drove to the local library, a small brick building that served 3 rural communities. The building was old but well-maintained, with a kind of solid construction that spoke of civic pride from an earlier era. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Brennan, was helpful but seemed nervous when Linda asked about the school's history. Mrs. Brennan was perhaps 70, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and glasses that magnified her pale blue eyes. She moved with the careful precision of someone whose joints protested sudden movements, but her mind was clearly sharp. When Linda mentioned Millbrook Elementary, the old woman's hand stilled on the card file she'd been organizing. "Millbrook Elementary," she said, consulting a card file that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Carter administration, built in 1965. Before that, there was a one-room schoolhouse on the same site, dating back to the 1800s. "I'm looking for information about a teacher named Catherine," Linda said. "She worked there recently, but I can't find any record of her employment." "Mrs. Brennan's face went pale, and she glanced around the empty library as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Catherine Blackwood," she whispered. "You're asking about Catherine Blackwood." The name sent a chill through Linda's chest, like ice water flowing through her veins. "Yes, I think so. Can you tell me about her?" Mrs. Brennan glanced around the empty library again, then pulled out a folder from beneath the counter. Her movements were furtive, conspiratorial, as if she was sharing forbidden knowledge. "This isn't supposed to be in the general collection," she said. "Local history, but the kind we don't like to talk about, the kind that makes people uncomfortable." The folder contained newspaper clippings dating back to 1873, the paper yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. The headlines told a story that made Linda's blood run cold. "Local teacher dies in schoolhouse fire." "Children report continued lessons from deceased instructor." "Strange illness affects Millbrook students." "Parents demand investigation into missing children." Catherine Blackwood had been the school teacher in the original one-room schoolhouse. According to the articles, she had died in a fire that had consumed the building during a fierce winter storm in February of 1874. Her body had been found at her desk, apparently trying to protect her students' papers from the flames. The children had escaped, but Catherine had perished in the blaze. But the children who had survived the fire claimed that Miss Catherine continued to teach them, appearing in their homes, in the fields, anywhere they gathered. The articles described symptoms that matched exactly what Linda had observed. Children missing small pieces of themselves, displaying unusual behavior, speaking of lessons that couldn't have happened. One article, dated 6 months after the fire, described the testimony of young Mary Hutchinson, age 9. "Miss Catherine comes to me in the night. She says she needs parts of me to stay strong, to keep teaching us. I gave her my little finger, and now I understand numbers better than ever before. She says love means sharing everything, even the parts of ourselves we think we need." The phenomenon had continued for months after Catherine's death, with more children affected each week. The articles painted a picture of a community in crisis, parents torn between protecting their children and accepting what seemed to be miraculous educational progress. The affected children showed remarkable improvements in their studies, mastering complex concepts far beyond their years. But the price was becoming clear. Children were disappearing entirely, their families reporting that they had gone to study with Miss Catherine permanently. The remaining children spoke of classmates who had given so much of themselves that they had simply faded away, becoming part of their teacher's ever-growing collection. Finally, the community had abandoned the site entirely, building a new school in the next town over. The burned schoolhouse was left to decay, its foundations becoming overgrown with weeds and wild roses. For nearly a century, the site had remained empty, avoided by locals who knew the stories and respected the warnings passed down through generations. But the Millbrook site had been rebuilt in 1965, and the pattern had apparently resumed. Linda found records of mysterious illnesses, unexplained behavioral changes, and teacher turnover that stretched back decades. Every few years, the phenomenon would intensify, and teachers would leave suddenly. The community had learned to live with their ghost, to accept her presence as a fact of life. The most recent articles painted a familiar picture. In 1987, a teacher named Margaret Collins had lasted only 3 weeks before requesting an emergency transfer. In 1994, Robert Martinez had been found in his classroom after hours, mumbling about children who asked for sharing lessons. In 2006, Jennifer Walsh had simply vanished, her car found in the school parking lot with the engine still running. The final article in the folder was dated just 3 months ago. Local teacher missing, presumed dead. It was about Miss Catherine, the recent Miss Catherine, the one whose position Linda had taken. Her car had been found abandoned on a back road, but her body had never been recovered. The article mentioned that she had been displaying unusual behavior in the weeks before her disappearance, and that several parents had complained about her teaching methods. According to the report, the recent Miss Catherine had been talking to empty corners of her classroom, conducting conversations with someone the children claimed to see but adults could not. She had been assigning homework that involved sharing exercises, asking children to bring small personal items to school that were never returned. In her final week, she had been overheard telling a student that some gifts are too precious to keep to yourself. Linda drove back to the school as the sun was setting, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd discovered. The parking lot was empty, but she could see lights in the windows of room 12. Warm, golden light spilled from the classroom, creating a welcoming glow that seemed at odds with the growing darkness around the building. She parked and walked to the building, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The front door was locked, but she had keys. Principal Morrison had given her a full set, along with the security code for the alarm system. The hallway was dark except for the light spilling from her classroom, and she could hear voices, children's voices, reciting something in unison. The sound made her skin crawl. It was after 7 in the evening. No children should be in the building. But the voices were unmistakably young, high and clear, chanting words that Linda couldn't quite make out through the closed door. She crept toward room 12, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the slightly open door, she could see them. All 24 of her students sat in their desks, their faces turned toward the front of the room. But they looked different in the strange light, paler, more ethereal, as if they were slowly becoming transparent. At the teacher's desk sat a woman in a blue dress with white buttons, her long dark hair hanging around her shoulders like a curtain. But there was something wrong with her appearance. She seemed to be made of shadows and missing pieces, as if she was constructed from the parts the children had given her. Her left hand was clearly a child's hand, too small for her adult frame. Her face was a patchwork of different skin tones and textures, assembled from donations made over more than a century. Linda watched in horror as the woman reached out and touched Timothy's face. Where her finger made contact, a small piece of his cheek simply vanished, absorbed into her own flesh. Timothy smiled with the expression of a child who had just given his teacher an apple, his face glowing with satisfaction. "Very good, Timothy," the woman said in a voice like wind through dead leaves. "You're learning so well. Soon you'll understand everything, just like all the others who came before you." The woman's eyes moved to the door, and Linda found herself staring into a gaze that held the accumulated hunger of more than a century. Catherine Blackwood smiled, her teeth made of borrowed ivory from generations of children, her lips composed of flesh from countless small mouths. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, "how wonderful that you've come to join us. The children have been telling me so much about you. I think it's time you learned what we really teach at Millbrook Elementary." Linda tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The paralysis spread through her body like ice water, freezing her muscles and trapping her in place. The children turned in their seats, their faces glowing with the same terrible satisfaction she'd seen that morning. They began to recite in unison, their voices blending into a sound that was almost musical. "We share ourselves with Miss Catherine. We give her pieces so she can stay. We learn the most important lesson of all, that love means letting someone consume you, one small piece at a time." Linda felt something shift in her perception, as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes. She could see the truth now. The classroom was filled with more than just the 24 children she taught. Dozens of other young faces watched from the shadows, children from decades past who had given everything to their beloved teacher. They smiled with holes where their eyes should be, waved with hands missing fingers, spoke with mouths that had donated their tongues. She understood now why the other teachers had left. why the substitutes had fled, but she also understood why the children were so calm, so content. They had found purpose in their sacrifice, meaning in their gradual consumption. They were part of something larger than themselves, contributing to the immortality of someone they loved. Catherine Blackwood stood from her desk, her form becoming more solid as she moved. The borrowed pieces of her body moved in harmony, creating the illusion of wholeness from fragments. "Don't be afraid," she said. "Teaching is about sharing knowledge, about passing something of yourself to your students. I've simply found a more literal way to do that." Linda felt her resistance crumbling as the children's chant continued. There was something hypnotic about their voices, something that made her want to join them, to become part of their circle. She thought about her empty apartment, her dwindling savings, the rejection letters from school districts that no longer had room for teachers like her. Here was a place where she was needed, where her presence mattered. All it would cost was a small piece of herself, and then another and another, until there was nothing left to give. But by then, she would understand what the children already knew, that true teaching meant feeding someone else's hunger with your own substance, nurturing their growth with your own diminishment. Catherine Blackwood extended her hand, and Linda saw that it was made of borrowed flesh, assembled from decades of willing sacrifices. The fingers were different sizes and skin tones, stitched together with invisible thread. "Come," she said. "Let me show you what real education looks like. Let me teach you what it means to truly give of yourself." The children's chant grew louder, more insistent, and Linda felt herself stepping forward. Each step brought new understanding, new clarity about the nature of love and sacrifice. The classroom began to change around her, expanding to accommodate all the students Catherine had collected over the years. Hundreds of children sat in neat rows, their missing pieces glowing like stars in the eternal twilight of the classroom. Linda felt her own skin begin to change, becoming more pliable, more willing to be shared. She understood now that this wasn't horror, it was transcendence. Catherine Blackwood had found a way to make love literal, to transform the metaphorical act of giving oneself for others into something real and lasting. As Catherine's borrowed hand touched Linda's cheek, she felt a piece of herself slip away, joining the collective that was her teacher's reconstructed form. But instead of loss, she felt completion. She was becoming part of something eternal, something that would continue to teach and love and consume long after the world had forgotten what education used to mean. The children smiled as Linda took her place among them, her missing piece glowing softly in Catherine's reconstructed face. Together they would wait for the next substitute teacher, the next person who needed to understand that some hungers could never be satisfied, only temporarily fed. And in the feeding, in the sharing, in the slow consumption of willing flesh, they would find the kind of immortality that only comes from devouring the innocent, one small piece at a time. Outside, the autumn wind picked up, carrying the sound of children's voices across the empty fields, but the farmers knew better than to investigate. They had learned, through generations of hard experience, that some lessons were too dangerous to learn and some teachers too hungry to satisfy. The school would continue its work, patient and eternal, waiting for the next batch of children to arrive each September. And Catherine Blackwood would continue to teach them the most important lesson of all, that love is consumption, that knowledge comes through sacrifice, and that the best students are the ones willing to give everything they have to their teacher's insatiable need. Michael had restored enough paintings to recognize the signs of age, neglect, and deliberate damage. But the canvas that arrived at his workshop on a gray Tuesday morning in November carried with it an aura of wrongness that made his trained eye hesitate. The painting, wrapped in layers of protective cloth, had been discovered in the estate sale of a recently deceased collector. The broker who delivered it, a nervous man named Carruthers, had been eager to complete the transaction and leave. Carruthers was the kind of man who dealt in questionable provenance, the sort who asked no questions about how certain artworks had found their way into private collections. His hands shook as he handled the paperwork, and he kept glancing at the wrapped painting as if it might move when he wasn't watching. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool November air, and his usually smooth sales pitch came out in stammered fragments. 17th century, possibly earlier, Carruthers had said, wiping perspiration from his forehead with a handkerchief that was already damp. The deceased was quite specific about wanting it restored, left detailed instructions, along with payment for the work, said it was the most important piece in his collection, said it needed to be awakened. The word choice struck Michael as odd. Paintings needed to be cleaned, restored, or preserved, but awakened. That suggested something alive, something sleeping that could be roused to consciousness. But Carruthers had already thrust the paperwork at him and backed toward the door, clearly eager to be away from both the painting and the responsibility it represented. Michael's workshop occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in the arts district, its north-facing windows providing the steady light necessary for detailed work. The space was organized with the precision of a surgeon's theater, brushes arranged by size and purpose, solvents labeled and dated, magnifying equipment positioned for optimal access. He'd been restoring art for 23 years, building a reputation for handling the most challenging pieces, paintings that other restorers deemed too damaged, too dangerous, or too strange to touch. His clients included private collectors who preferred discretion, museums with pieces too valuable to risk in less experienced hands, and occasionally, individuals who preferred not to explain how they'd acquired their particular treasures. Michael had learned not to ask questions about provenance, focusing instead on the technical challenges each piece presented. Art was art, regardless of how it had survived the centuries. The painting, when finally unwrapped, stood nearly 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, its ornate gilded frame suggesting both wealth and importance. The frame itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Vines and flowers twisted around the edges, but looking closer, Michael realized that what he'd initially taken for botanical motifs were actually representations of human anatomical structures, arteries disguised as stems, organs masquerading as blossoms. But the image itself was almost completely obscured by centuries of grime, smoke damage, and what appeared to be deliberate vandalism. Someone had scratched at the surface with sharp implements, creating gouges that went deep into the paint layers. Other sections showed burn marks, as if candles had been held too close to the canvas for extended periods. The overall effect was of a work that had been attacked rather than merely neglected, as if successive generations had tried to destroy it but couldn't bring themselves to finish the job. What Michael could see of the original painting suggested a religious or mythological scene, robed figures arranged around a central altar or table, their faces indistinct beneath the accumulated damage. The style reminded him of the darker works of Caravaggio or Goya, full of shadow and implied violence. But there was something about the composition that made him uncomfortable, a sense that the figures were arranged not for worship but for something far more sinister. The colors that showed through the damage were unusual, deep reds that seemed to pulse with their own light, blacks so absolute they appeared to absorb illumination rather than reflect it. The painter had used techniques that Michael had never encountered before, layering pigments in ways that created an almost three-dimensional effect. In some areas, the paint appeared to have actual depth, as if the canvas was a window rather than a flat surface. He began with the standard procedure, photographing the piece from multiple angles, documenting every flaw and inconsistency. Under the magnifying glass, he could see that the painting had been worked on before, possibly multiple times. There were layers of overpainting, crude attempts at restoration that had done more harm than good. Some sections showed signs of having been deliberately defaced, then restored, then defaced again, as if the painting had been caught in a cycle of destruction and renewal spanning centuries. The brushstrokes in the original work were masterful, showing the hand of someone with extraordinary skill. But there were inconsistencies that troubled Michael, areas where the technique seemed to change mid-composition, as if multiple artists had worked on the piece simultaneously. Some sections showed the confident strokes of a master painter, while others displayed the tentative marks of someone learning as they worked. The first day's work involved testing solvents on a small corner section, finding the right combination of chemicals to remove the surface grime without damaging the original paint. Michael had performed this process thousands of times, but something about this particular canvas made him hesitant. The paint seemed to respond to his touch in ways that didn't quite make sense. Areas that should have been brittle remained flexible, while sections that looked stable flaked away at the slightest pressure. When he applied the first solvent test, the reaction was immediate and unsettling. The chemical didn't simply dissolve the surface grime, it seemed to cause the painting to bleed, dark fluid seeping from the canvas and pooling on his workbench. The smell was organic, metallic, like copper pennies left in the rain. Michael told himself it was simply the reaction of old pigments to modern chemicals, but the fluid was warm to the touch and had a consistency that reminded him uncomfortably of blood. It was during the second day that he found the first tooth. He was working on a section in the upper right corner, using a soft brush to remove layers of accumulated soot, when something small and hard fell onto his workbench. At first, he thought it was a paint chip, but when he picked it up, he realized he was holding a human molar, yellow with age but perfectly preserved. The tooth was embedded in the paint itself, not merely stuck to the surface. When he examined the area where it had fallen from, he could see a small cavity in the paint layer, as if the tooth had been deliberately incorporated into the pigment. Under his magnifying glass, the tooth showed signs of having been professionally extracted. The roots were intact and showed the clean cuts of surgical instruments. But the age of the specimen suggested it predated modern dentistry by centuries. How had medieval artists acquired human teeth with such precision, and why would they want to incorporate them into their paint? Michael stared at the tooth for several minutes, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. It was possible, he told himself, that the original artist had used unconventional materials. Throughout history, painters had incorporated everything from crushed gems to pulverized bones into their pigments. Egyptian blue contained copper, Indian yellow was made from the urine of cows fed on mango leaves, and vermilion contained mercury that could drive artists mad over time. But the tooth was too well preserved, too obviously human, to be dismissed as mere artistic eccentricity. The enamel was intact, the dentin visible where the crown met the roots. Under ultraviolet light, it showed the characteristic fluorescence of organic material, confirming its biological origin. This wasn't some exotic mineral or processed animal product. It was an actual human tooth, somehow preserved in paint for centuries. He continued working, telling himself that he'd simply found an unusual example of period technique, but as he removed more layers of grime, more teeth appeared. They were scattered throughout the paint like seeds, each one perfectly preserved, each one unmistakably human. Some were molars, ground down by years of use. Others were incisors, sharp and white as ivory. A few were the smaller teeth that children lose in their 7th or 8th year, tiny and delicate as pearls. All of them were embedded so deeply in the paint that they seemed to be part of the original composition. The artist hadn't simply stuck teeth onto a finished work, they had mixed them into the pigment itself, creating a paint that was part mineral, part organic matter. The technical skill required for such a process was staggering, but the motivation behind it remained unclear. By the end of the week, Michael had collected 17 teeth and was beginning to find other things. Hair, long and dark, woven into the paint like thread. The strands were human, showing the cellular structure that distinguished them from animal fibers. Some were fine and silky, suggesting they had come from young victims. Others were coarser, gray with age, speaking of older donors who had contributed to the artist's grotesque palette. Fingernails appeared next, some still bearing traces of polish or decoration that suggested they had been taken from living hands rather than corpses. The nails were whole, torn out at the roots, their undersides showing the quick that would have caused excruciating pain when removed. What looked like small fragments of bone were ground fine but still recognizable under magnification, pieces of femur, fragments of rib, splinters of skull that caught the light like tiny mirrors. The painting wasn't just decorated with human remains, it was made from them. The very canvas appeared to be stretched human skin, carefully treated and prepared like the finest vellum. The frame, which he had initially thought was carved wood, revealed itself under close examination to be constructed from human bones, femurs and tibias shaped into decorative elements, ribs bent into curving patterns, finger bones arranged like delicate flowers. The figures in the painting were becoming clearer as he worked, and what he revealed made his hands shake as he held his brushes. The robed figures weren't worshippers or mythological beings. They were surgeons, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their hands holding instruments that gleamed with a metallic sheen that seemed to move in the light. The instruments were real, Michael realized. Actual surgical tools somehow embedded in the paint surface, their edges sharp enough to cut. The central altar was actually an operating table, and the figure lying upon it was very much alive, his mouth open in a scream that Michael could almost hear. The victim's eyes were wide with terror, painted with such skill that they seemed to track movement. His body showed the precise cuts of surgical instruments, each wound rendered with the accuracy of someone who had studied anatomy firsthand. But it was the eyes that disturbed him most. Every figure in the painting, the surgeons, the victim, even the shadowy observers in the background, had eyes that seemed to track his movements. Under the magnifying glass, he could see that the eyes were painted with extraordinary detail, each iris rendered with individual brushstrokes that created an almost photographic realism. But there was something wrong with the perspective, as if the eyes were looking out of the painting rather than existing within it. As Michael removed more layers of accumulated grime, he began to notice that the eyes weren't just painted, they were real. Each figure had been given actual human eyes, somehow preserved and embedded in the paint. The corneas were cloudy with age, but the irises retained their color: brown, blue, green, hazel, a rainbow of humanity trapped forever in their two-dimensional prison. The preservation technique was beyond anything Michael had encountered in his years of study. The eye showed no signs of decomposition, no shrinkage or distortion that would normally occur with organic matter over time. They remained moist, glistening with what appeared to be natural fluids. When he shone his work lamp directly on them, the pupils dilated and contracted, as if responding to the light. Michael called his mentor, Professor Whitmore, who had taught him the fundamentals of restoration at the university. Whitmore had seen every kind of artistic aberration in his 40 years of study, and Michael hoped he might provide some context for what he was discovering. The old professor had written extensively on unusual materials in historical art, documenting everything from the use of human ash in medieval manuscripts to the incorporation of blood in ancient cave paintings. Human remains in paint? Whitmore's voice crackled through the phone, made thin by the poor connection across the city. It's not unheard of, Michael. Medieval artists sometimes used bone meal as a white pigment. Egyptian painters incorporated mummy dust into their browns. There are documented cases of artists using their own blood for particularly meaningful works. Michael described the teeth, the hair, the eyes that seemed to follow his movements. He tried to keep his voice steady, professional, but he could hear the strain creeping in as he detailed each discovery. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment before responding, and when he spoke, his tone had changed. Michael, I think you should photograph everything and contact the authorities. What you're describing sounds less like art restoration and more like evidence of something criminal. The preservation of organic materials you're describing shouldn't be possible without modern techniques. But Michael found himself reluctant to stop working. The painting was beginning to reveal secrets that no other living person had seen, and the professional in him was fascinated by the technical skill required to incorporate organic materials into paint. The challenge was unlike anything he'd encountered, pushing the boundaries of what he thought possible in art restoration. The eyes, in particular, were masterfully preserved. Under his magnifying glass, he could see the individual blood vessels in the sclera, the fine structures of the iris that created each unique pattern, the way the pupil opened and closed in response to changes in light. The corneal surface remained clear and smooth, showing none of the cloudiness that should have developed over centuries of exposure. It was during the third week that the eyes began to blink. At first, Michael thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection from his work lamps creating the illusion of movement. But as he leaned closer to examine a particularly complex section where multiple layers of paint created an almost sculptural relief, he saw one of the surgeon figures clearly close and open its eyes. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if the figure was trying to communicate something through the only means available to it. Michael stepped back from the painting, his heart racing. The workshop suddenly felt too small, too close, as if the walls were pressing in around him. He rubbed his own eyes, wondering if the long hours of detailed work were affecting his vision. But when he looked again, the eyes in every visible figure were now moving, blinking in sequence, their gaze following him as he moved around the workshop. The central victim's eyes were wide with terror, darting back and forth as if he was trying to escape from some invisible restraint. The painted tears on his cheeks seemed fresh, glistening with moisture that caught the light. His mouth remained open in that eternal scream, but his eyes pleaded for help, for release, for any form of mercy that might end his suffering. The surgeon's eyes held a different expression, one of hunger, of anticipation, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Their painted hands seemed to grip their instruments more tightly, the metal implements gleaming with what looked like fresh blood. The observers in the background watched with the cold interest of scientists studying a specimen, their eyes bright with intelligence and terrible purpose. That night, Michael dreamed of the painting. In his dream, he stood in the same workshop, but the painting had grown to fill the entire wall. The figures were moving now, their hands gesturing, their mouths opening and closing as if they were trying to speak. The central victim was struggling against bonds that weren't visible in the painting, his screams echoing through the workshop with a sound like breaking glass. The surgeons leaned over him, their instruments gleaming, and Michael realized that he was watching the scene depicted in the painting as it actually happened. This wasn't a representation of violence, it was violence itself, trapped in two-dimensional space but still occurring, still real, still causing pain to the victim who would never die because death was impossible in the painted world. But the most disturbing part of the dream was the realization that the painting was still being created. With each cut of the surgeon's instruments, with each drop of blood that fell from the victim's body, the painting grew more detailed, more real. The victim's flesh was being harvested, processed, and incorporated into the very paint that depicted his torture. He was simultaneously the subject and the medium, his suffering creating the art that immortalized his pain. Michael woke with the taste of copper in his mouth and found that his hands were stained with something that looked like paint but smelled like blood. The stains went deep into his skin, following the lines of his palms and the whorls of his fingerprints. When he tried to wash them off, the water ran red, swirling down the drain like liquid guilt. He returned to the workshop the next morning with a mixture of dread and compulsion that he couldn't explain. The painting seemed different in the daylight, more vivid, more present. The figures appeared to have shifted slightly during the night, as if they had been moving when no one was watching. The central victim's position on the table had changed, his head turned toward the door as if he had been waiting for Michael's return. As he resumed his work, removing more layers of accumulated grime, Michael began to understand the true horror of what he was restoring. The painting wasn't just made with human remains. It was a dimensional portal, a window into a scene that was still happening somewhere beyond the canvas. The surgeons he was revealing weren't just painted figures. They were actual beings, trapped in the two-dimensional space of the painting, but somehow still alive, still conscious, still engaged in their terrible work. The victim on the table was real too, Michael realized. His screams were silent only because sound couldn't cross the dimensional barrier between the painting and the physical world. But his suffering was genuine, his terror authentic. He had been trapped in this moment of agony for centuries, experiencing the same torture over and over again, his flesh being harvested repeatedly to create the very pigments that imprisoned him. Michael found more evidence as he worked. Sections of skin, preserved and stretched thin, formed the canvas beneath the paint. Tendons and sinew had been woven into the fabric of the frame. The ornate golden decorations around the edges weren't metal at all. They were human bones, polished and shaped to resemble precious materials. The entire painting was an elaborate construction made from the remains of countless victims. But the most disturbing discovery came when Michael began working on the background figures. As he removed the grime from their faces, he began to recognize some of them. The figure in the shadows behind the operating table looked remarkably like Carruthers, the nervous broker who had delivered the painting. Another figure, partially hidden behind a pillar, bore a strong resemblance to the deceased collector who had owned the piece. Michael realized with growing horror that the painting was adding new figures, incorporating the essence of everyone who came into contact with it. The previous restorers who had worked on the piece were probably represented somewhere in the composition, trapped forever in the two-dimensional prison that fed on human suffering. The deceased collector hadn't owned the painting. He had been consumed by it, becoming part of its eternal tableau of torture. As the weeks passed, Michael found himself unable to stay away from the workshop. The painting called to him with a voice that he could feel in his bones, promising revelations that would transform his understanding of art, of reality, of the thin barriers between dimensions. He worked longer hours, skipping meals, ignoring phone calls from friends and colleagues who worried about his increasingly haggard appearance. The figures in the painting were becoming more active. Michael would arrive at the workshop to find that they had moved during the night, rearranging themselves into new configurations. The surgeons had begun to look directly at him as he worked, their painted mouths moving in silent communication. Sometimes, when the light hit the canvas at just the right angle, Michael could swear he saw their hands reaching out from the surface, grasping at the air just inches from his face. It was Professor Whitmore who finally forced Michael to confront what was happening. The older man arrived at the workshop unannounced, concerned about Michael's failure to return his calls. When he saw the painting, his face went pale with recognition and horror. "Dear God, Michael," he whispered. "Do you know what this is?" Michael looked up from his work, his eyes bloodshot from weeks of close examination. "It's the most complex restoration I've ever undertaken," he said. "The techniques involved are unprecedented. The integration of organic materials into the paint matrix suggests a level of sophistication that shouldn't have been possible in the 17th century. Whitmore grabbed Michael's shoulders, forcing him to look away from the painting. "This isn't art, Michael. This is an abomination. I've seen references to this piece in restricted texts, warnings about paintings that consume their viewers. The man who commissioned this was a practitioner of the darkest arts, someone who found a way to trap souls in two-dimensional space." But Michael pulled away from his mentor's grip, his attention already returning to the canvas. "You don't understand," he said. "It's not just a painting, it's a window. I can see through it, Professor. I can see the other side." Whitmore tried to convince Michael to stop working, to contact the authorities, to destroy the painting before it could claim another victim, but Michael was already lost. He had spent too many hours staring into those painted eyes, too many nights dreaming of the scene they depicted. The boundary between himself and the painting had begun to blur, and he could feel himself being drawn into the composition that had consumed so many others. On the final night, Michael worked until dawn, removing the last layers of grime from the painting's surface. The image was now completely revealed, and what he saw made him understand the true purpose of his restoration. The painting wasn't just a window into another dimension, it was a recruiting tool, a way for the entities trapped within to find new additions to their eternal tableau. The central victim on the operating table was no longer a stranger. As Michael cleaned away the final traces of accumulated dirt, he saw his own face staring back at him, his own eyes wide with the terror of someone who had just realized the trap he had walked into. The surgeons around the table smiled with painted mouths, their instruments ready to begin their work on their newest acquisition. Michael felt the canvas reaching out to him, its surface becoming fluid, permeable. The painted eyes called to him with voices that promised an end to loneliness, to uncertainty, to the mundane struggles of human existence. All he had to do was step forward, to press his hand against the surface, to allow himself to be absorbed into the composition that had consumed so many others. As he reached toward the painting, Michael caught sight of his reflection in the window of his workshop. His face was already beginning to change, becoming more two-dimensional, more painted than real. His skin had taken on the flat quality of pigment applied to canvas, and his eyes held the same desperate expression that he had seen in all the other victims. He was becoming part of the painting even before he touched it. The transformation was both terrifying and oddly peaceful. Michael felt his three-dimensional form being compressed, flattened, reduced to the essential elements that could exist within the painting's reality. His consciousness remained intact, but it was being reshaped, reformed to fit the requirements of his new existence. He could feel his memories being processed, his experiences being converted into the raw material that would sustain the painting's terrible hunger. The last thing Michael remembered as a fully human being was the feeling of canvas against his palm, the sensation of his flesh being dissolved and reformed into pigment. He felt his body being broken down into its component elements, blood becoming red paint, bone becoming white, his organs transformed into the various colors that would represent his suffering in the eternal tableau. But death, as he had feared, was not the end. Michael's consciousness survived the transformation, trapped within the two-dimensional space of the painting. He found himself standing among the other victims, his painted form adding another figure to the composition that had claimed so many lives over the centuries. The surgeons welcomed him with their terrible smiles, explaining that he would now participate in their eternal work. The painting, Michael learned, was more than just a portal. It was a factory, a place where human suffering was processed and refined into something that could sustain the entities that had created it. Each victim brought their own unique qualities to the composition, their individual pain and terror adding new dimensions to the work. Michael's artistic knowledge made him particularly valuable, and the surgeons assigned him the task of maintaining the technical aspects of their creation. He learned that the painting had a long history, passed from collector to collector, each owner eventually being absorbed into its reality. The process was always the same. The painting would arrive damaged, requiring restoration, and the restorer would be drawn in by the technical challenges it presented. They would work longer and longer hours, becoming obsessed with the piece, until finally they would cross the threshold from observer to participant. The authorities found the workshop 3 days later, after Professor Whitmore's frantic calls to the police. The painting sat on its easel, completely restored, its surface gleaming with fresh varnish. There was no sign of Michael except for a few scattered tools and a magnifying glass that still held traces of what might have been blood. The brushes were clean, arranged with the precision that had always marked Michael's work, as if he had simply finished his restoration and walked away. The painting was quietly removed from the workshop and placed in storage, its location known only to a select few who understood the danger it represented, but storage was only a temporary solution. The painting had a way of finding its way back into the world, of attracting new victims who thought they could master its secrets without being consumed by them. Art dealers would receive mysterious calls from anonymous sellers, offering pieces of exceptional quality at prices that seemed too good to be true. Museum curators would find donations on their doorsteps, accompanied by notes explaining that the donor wished to remain anonymous. Private collectors would discover the painting at estate sales, drawn by its obvious quality and the mystery of its provenance. And somewhere in the painted shadows of the composition, Michael continues his work, his consciousness trapped in an eternal moment of restoration. He tends to the organic components of the painting, harvesting fresh materials from new victims, maintaining the delicate balance between art and horror that keeps the portal functional. His artistic training serves him well in this role, as he helps to integrate new victims into the composition with the skill of a master craftsman. The surgeons have taught him their techniques, showing him how to extract the essential elements from human consciousness and transform them into pigment. He has learned to appreciate the subtleties of different types of suffering, the way that terror creates richer reds while despair produces deeper blacks. Each emotion has its own color, its own texture, its own contribution to the overall composition. Michael tries to warn the new victims, but his voice can only reach them through the painted eyes that follow their movements. He watches as restoration specialists and art historians examine the painting, drawn by its technical complexity and apparent age. He sees them making the same mistakes he made, becoming obsessed with the work, staying late into the night to uncover its secrets. Sometimes he manages to make the painting bleed, hoping that the sight of fresh fluid seeping from centuries-old paint will frighten away potential victims. But they always rationalize what they see, explaining it as unusual chemical reactions or previously unknown preservation techniques. Their scientific minds work against them, seeking logical explanations for phenomena that defy rational understanding. The painting waits, patient and hungry, for the next restorer who believes they can uncover its secrets without becoming part of them. Each new victim brings fresh materials, new techniques, new ways of thinking about the relationship between art and reality. The composition grows more complex with each edition, more detailed, more convincing in its portrayal of eternal suffering. Into the painted depths of its dimensional portal, Michael and all the others continue their eternal work, adding new details to the composition, preparing for the next victim who will help them expand their terrible masterpiece. They have learned that art is not just representation, it is consumption, transformation, the conversion of life into something that exists beyond the boundaries of normal reality. The painting teaches them that beauty and horror are not opposites but partners, that the most compelling art comes from the marriage of skill and suffering. They are creating something that will outlast human civilization, a work that will continue to attract victims long after the last museum has crumbled and the last art critic has been silenced. In their two-dimensional prison, time moves differently. Centuries pass like moments, and moments stretch into eternities. They are all there together, the original victims from centuries past, the recent additions who brought modern techniques to their ancient work, and the spaces reserved for future contributors who have not yet been born. Michael knows that somewhere in the world, another restoration specialist is receiving a call about an unusual piece that requires expert attention. Someone is being told about a painting with mysterious provenance and technical challenges that will test the limits of their skill. Someone is about to make the same choice he made, to prioritize professional curiosity over personal safety. And when that person arrives at their workshop, when they unwrap the painting and see its damaged surface, when they feel the first stirrings of professional excitement at the challenge it represents, Michael will be watching through painted eyes, trying to warn them of what they're about to discover, but he knows they won't listen, just as he didn't listen to Professor Whitmore's warnings. The painting will claim them, as it has claimed so many others, and they will join the eternal composition that grows more complex and more horrible with each passing generation. They will learn, as Michael learned, that some knowledge comes at a price too terrible to pay, but by then it will be too late to turn back. The cycle continues, as it has for centuries, as it will for centuries to come. The painting waits in its storage facility, dreaming of galleries and workshops, of curious experts and ambitious restorers. It knows that human nature will ensure its eventual return to the world, that someone will always be willing to risk everything for the chance to uncover the secrets of a true masterpiece. And in the meantime, Michael and his fellow prisoners work on adding brushstroke after brushstroke to their eternal canvas, creating a work of art that feeds on human suffering and grows stronger with each new victim. They are both the artists and the medium, the creators and the created, trapped forever in a masterpiece that will never be finished because it can never stop consuming the very people who make it possible. And so another door closes in the nightmare house of horror, but the echoes of what you've witnessed will follow you long after you've left these halls. Tonight, you've encountered the virus, the ghost, and the portal, 3 faces of corruption that have learned to hide in plain sight, wearing the masks of creativity, education, and artistry. The photographer's darkroom, once a sanctuary of artistic expression, revealed itself as a breeding ground for viral trauma. The elementary classroom, meant to nurture young minds, became a feeding ground for something ancient and hungry. The restorer's workshop, dedicated to preserving beauty, transformed into a dimensional gateway where human suffering becomes eternal art. These are not the monsters that announce themselves with theatrical flourishes. These are the horrors that wait in the spaces we trust most, our workplaces, our schools, our galleries. They understand that the deepest violations come not from attacking what we fear, but from corrupting what we love. The photographer will never again trust the images emerging from chemical baths. The teacher will forever question the perfect behavior of 2 quiet children. The art lover will find themselves studying every painting's eyes, watching for that telltale movement that suggests something watches back. You carry these seeds of doubt with you now, planted in the fertile soil of your everyday experience. They will bloom whenever you develop photographs, walk past empty classrooms, or admire works that seem almost too lifelike. The virus spreads through vision itself, the ghost feeds on willing sacrifice, and the portal transforms creativity into consumption. But perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Perhaps the true gift of horror is not the momentary startle, but the permanent expansion of possibility, the knowledge that our safe, rational world is far more fragile than we ever dared imagine. If tonight's trinity of terror has infected your perception in ways that feel both terrifying and strangely satisfying, show your appreciation with a like, and share this darkness with others who understand that true horror doesn't just frighten, it transforms. Subscribe to Nightmare House of Horror to never miss when we unlock another door to terror, where every tale is crafted to follow you home. The house has many more rooms to explore, each hiding its own unique brand of corruption. Until we meet again in these halls of perpetual midnight, remember, the ordinary world around you is not as solid as it appears. Every photograph might hide an impossible figure. Every classroom might harbor a hunger that feeds on innocence. Every masterpiece might be a window into suffering that knows no end. Sweet dreams, if the virus, the ghost, and the portal will allow them.